I never thought the day would come when I would watch my parents renew their vows in a ceremony I had paid for from start to finish, while they acted as though I was merely a courtesy guest they had reluctantly allowed to attend. The garden venue overlooking the coastline had cost me nearly $30,000. The flowers alone were $8,000, and the photographer they insisted on having flown in from New York had added another $12,000 to the bill that I quietly handled without ever asking them to contribute a single cent. My mother wore a custom silk gown that I had commissioned from a designer she had admired for years, and my father stood there in his tailored Italian suit that I had purchased for him during a business trip to Milan, both of them glowing with happiness as their friends and extended family applauded their enduring love story. I had been funding their lifestyle for almost 15 years, ever since I had made my first significant amount of money in tech consulting, and they had come to me with tears in their eyes, explaining how they were drowning in debt and facing foreclosure on the house I had grown up in. I had written the check without hesitation, cleared their mortgage, paid off their credit cards, and set up monthly transfers to cover their living expenses so they could retire early and enjoy their golden years without financial stress. Over the years, those transfers had grown larger as their tastes became more expensive, as they traded their modest sedan for a luxury SUV that I made the down payment on, as they booked cruises to Alaska and river tours through Europe that I funded, as they remodeled their kitchen twice because my mother could never quite get the aesthetic right. I had sacrificed my own dreams of buying a house in the city where I worked, continued renting a small apartment and driving a 10-year-old car because every spare dollar I earned went directly into supporting them and making sure they never wanted for anything. My younger brother had contributed nothing over the years, had actually borrowed money from them that I knew came from the accounts I kept filled, and yet somehow he was the golden child who could do no wrong while I was treated like an obligation they had to tolerate. During the reception, as guests mingled and champagne flowed freely from the premium bar I had paid for, my mother approached me with her friends surrounding her like a protective barrier of perfumed judgment. She looked at me with that particular expression she reserved for moments when I had somehow disappointed her despite doing everything she asked, her lips pressed into a thin line and her eyes cold in a way that made my stomach drop even before she opened her mouth to speak. Her friends were watching with poorly concealed curiosity, these women who had known me since I was a child, but who now looked at me as though I were a stranger who had crashed an exclusive party. My mother leaned in close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume, the one I had bought her for her birthday last month, and she said in a voice just loud enough for her friends to hear that I should be grateful they had even invited me to this celebration, considering how little I had done to support the family over the years. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs as I stood there in the dress I had carefully selected to make sure I looked presentable, but not so polished that I would draw attention away from her on her special day. Her friends nodded in agreement, one of them even adding that it was generous of my parents to include me given how I had apparently turned my back on family values by being so focused on my career and never settling down to give them grandchildren the way my brother had with his 3 kids. I wanted to scream, wanted to pull out my phone and show them the banking app with 15 years of transaction history proving that I had given my parents over $800,000 in direct support, wanted to list every sacrifice I had made while they sipped wine on Mediterranean terraces and sent me photos of sunsets I was too busy working to see myself. Instead, I smiled, thanked my mother for the opportunity to attend, and excused myself to the bathroom where I locked myself in a stall and let the rage and hurt wash over me in waves that left me shaking. I had already been preparing something for months, a contingency plan born from a growing suspicion that my contributions were not only unappreciated but actively resented, and now I knew exactly what I needed to do. I composed myself, fixed my makeup, and returned to the reception where I played the role of the dutiful daughter for the remainder of the evening, congratulating them on their beautiful ceremony and wishing them many more years of happiness. The next morning, I contacted my financial advisor and set in motion the changes I had been considering, redirecting all monthly transfers to a separate investment account in my name only, removing myself as the joint account holder on their credit cards, and scheduling a meeting with an attorney to formalize the documentation of every loan and gift I had provided over the years. My parents noticed the missing deposit within a week, and my father called me in a panic, asking if there had been some kind of banking error, his voice tight with the kind of stress I had rescued him from so many times before. I told him there was no error, that I had decided it was time for them to manage their own finances since they clearly felt I had contributed so little to the family, and that I would be focusing on my own future from this point forward. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped, and then my mother grabbed the phone and started screaming about how ungrateful I was, how they had raised me and sacrificed everything for my success, how I owed them for giving me life and opportunities. I listened calmly, years of practice keeping my voice steady as I reminded her that I was 38 years old, that I had put myself through college with scholarships and part-time jobs while they spent their money on my brother's private school tuition, that every dollar I had given them was because I loved them and wanted them to be happy, not because I owed them a debt that could never be repaid. She hung up on me, and for 3 months I heard nothing from either of them except a few hostile text messages from my brother calling me selfish and demanding I restore their funding immediately. I used that time to focus on myself for the first time in over a decade, finally putting a down payment on a small house with a garden where I could grow vegetables, upgrading my car to something reliable and safe, booking a vacation to Japan that I had been postponing for 5 years, and sleeping better than I had in ages without the constant anxiety of managing their crises. Then my father's sister called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice grave as she informed me that my father had passed away suddenly from a heart attack, and that the funeral would be held that weekend. The grief hit me harder than I expected despite the months of estrangement, because whatever else had happened, he was still my father, and I had loved him even when he had taken me for granted. I attended the funeral in a black dress I pulled from the back of my closet, sitting in the third row while my brother and his family occupied the front alongside my mother, who looked smaller and older than I remembered. She did not acknowledge my presence during the service, did not meet my eyes during the burial, and did not speak to me during the reception at their house, where I stood awkwardly near the kitchen wondering why I had even come. The following week, I received a formal notice that I was required to attend the reading of my father's will at the estate attorney's office, and I drove there with a sense of numb detachment that had become my default state when dealing with my family. My mother sat on one side of the conference table looking regal despite her mourning clothes, my brother and his wife beside her presenting a united front of shared DNA and expectations, while I sat alone on the opposite side feeling like I was facing a tribunal rather than attending a routine legal proceeding. The attorney, an older man with silver hair and tired eyes, began reading through the provisions of the will in the methodical tone of someone who had done this thousands of times, and I half listened as he distributed my father's belongings among the family members he had deemed worthy of remembering. The house went to my mother with the provision that it would eventually pass to my brother. The vintage car collection my father had assembled went entirely to my brother, who had always shared that interest. The stocks and bonds were divided between my mother and brother in a 70-30 split. And then the attorney paused and looked directly at me with something that might have been pity in his expression. He informed me that I was not included in the distribution of assets, that my father had specifically noted in the will that I had made it clear I did not need or want family support given my career success and financial independence, and that therefore all resources should be directed to those family members who both needed and appreciated what they were given. My mother actually smiled when he said this, a small satisfied curve of her lips that told me this had been planned, that she had probably insisted on this specific language, that this was her final punishment for my decision to stop funding their lifestyle. My brother looked uncomfortable for just a moment before his wife whispered something to him, and he nodded in agreement, apparently deciding that his inheritance was worth more than any loyalty to his sister. I sat there absorbing the information while they watched me, clearly expecting tears or anger or some kind of dramatic reaction that would validate their narrative of me as the selfish daughter who had abandoned her family. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a leather portfolio that I had brought specifically for this moment, having anticipated something like this might happen based on my mother's behavior at the vow renewal and the months of hostile silence that followed. I slid a stack of documents across the table to the attorney, legal records that I had spent considerable money having prepared by my own lawyer, detailed accounting of every payment I had made to my parents over 15 years with bank statements and canceled checks and transfer records, all meticulously organized and notarized. The attorney picked up the papers with a confused expression, began reading, and then his eyebrows rose steadily higher as he worked through the documentation. My mother demanded to know what I was showing him, her voice sharp with sudden anxiety, and I finally spoke for the first time since entering the office. I explained calmly that the documents proved I had provided my parents with over $850,000 in direct financial support since I was 23 years old, that none of this had been structured as gifts, but rather as loans with a verbal understanding that they would be repaid if they were ever in a position to do so, and that my attorney had prepared this documentation specifically to establish a creditor claim against the estate. The attorney looked at my mother and brother with an expression that had shifted from pity to professional disapproval, asking if they had been aware of the extent of financial support I had provided, and my mother stammered something about how I had offered the money freely, and they had assumed it was a daughter's duty to help her parents. I added that I had additional documentation proving that the house they were inheriting had only remained in the family because I had prevented foreclosure with a payment of $120,000, that the luxury car my father had just bequeathed to my brother had been purchased with a down payment I had provided, and that the investment portfolio they were now dividing had been seeded with capital I had contributed during a period when they had completely depleted their retirement savings. My brother finally found his voice and accused me of lying, of fabricating these records, of trying to steal his inheritance, but the attorney cut him off and stated that the documents appeared legitimate and that if I was claiming creditor status, then the estate would need to settle those debts before any assets could be distributed to heirs. My mother's face had gone pale, and she asked in a trembling voice how much I was claiming I was owed, so I told her the truth, which was that with reasonable interest calculations the total amount came to just over $1 million, which exceeded the total value of the estate by approximately $200,000. The silence in that conference room was absolute, broken only by the sound of my sister-in-law flipping frantically through the papers as though she could find some loophole that would preserve their windfall. The attorney cleared his throat and suggested we schedule a follow-up meeting once he had time to review everything with the estate accountants, but he made it clear that if my claim was valid, then my mother would likely need to sell the house to settle the debt, and that my brother should not expect to receive anything at all. I stood up, collected my copies of the documentation, and told them I would be willing to negotiate a settlement that allowed my mother to keep the house if they were prepared to acknowledge publicly what I had contributed to this family and offer a sincere apology for the years of dismissal and disrespect. My mother was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks as she called me cruel and vindictive, asking how I could do this to her when she had just lost her husband, but I reminded her gently that she had chosen to exclude me from his will despite knowing exactly how much I had sacrificed for both of them. My brother tried a different approach, suddenly becoming conciliatory and suggesting we could work something out as a family, that surely I didn't want to leave our mother homeless, that we could find a compromise that respected everyone's contributions. I looked at him directly and asked when he had last contributed anything beyond showing up for holidays and producing grandchildren, asked if he had any documentation of supporting our parents financially or emotionally during the years when I was writing check after check to keep them comfortable. He had no answer, and his wife's expression had shifted from righteous anger to cold calculation as she realized their expected inheritance had just evaporated. I left them there in that conference room, walked out into the parking lot where afternoon sun was breaking through October clouds, and drove home to my small house with my rescue dog waiting at the door and my own retirement account finally growing now that I was investing in my future instead of theirs. The attorney called me 2 days later to inform me that my mother wanted to negotiate a settlement, that she was prepared to acknowledge my contributions and work out a payment plan that would allow her to keep the house, and that my brother had hired his own lawyer to contest the claim despite having no legal standing to do so. I told the attorney I would consider reasonable settlement terms, but that any agreement would need to include a written acknowledgement from both my mother and brother detailing exactly what I had provided over the years and a formal apology for their treatment of me. Documents that I would be free to share with extended family members who had been fed a narrative of me as the ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her parents in their time of need. Over the following weeks, we negotiated back and forth through lawyers, my mother alternating between tearful phone calls begging me to be reasonable and angry voicemails accusing me of destroying the family, while my brother sent me long text messages trying to guilt me into backing down by describing how his children were asking why Auntie was being mean to Grandma. I blocked his number after the 5th message and instructed my attorney to handle all communications, feeling lighter with each boundary I established and each attempt at manipulation I refused to accept. Eventually, we reached a settlement where my mother would retain the house but pay me $400,000 over 10 years. My brother would forfeit his inheritance entirely with those assets going to settle my claim, and both of them would sign a statement acknowledging my financial support and apologizing for their treatment of me at the vow renewal and in the will. My mother signed first, her handwriting shaky on the legal documents, and my brother held out for another week before his wife apparently convinced him that fighting a battle he couldn't win was pointless and expensive. The day the settlement was finalized, I received a short email from my mother saying she hoped I was satisfied now that I had taken everything from her, and I responded with an even shorter email saying that I had actually left her with far more than she had tried to leave me, and that perhaps she might spend some of her remaining years reflecting on the difference between supporting family and enabling them to take you for granted.